let in.
Okay.
I'm going live. Try to do that first.
Jen just said she's going.
Okay. And then I'm going to let everybody in, okay? Everybody's good? All right.
Yep. Yep.
Slavery and racial reparations, except for
Been postponed.
Guns.
The district announced this afternoon.
I'm just going to mute people.
We're in.
Yeah, if you guys if people coming in can mute yourselves, that'll help me out from having to mute everybody individually.
I didn't hear what you said.
Future.
I'm just muting people.
Name will come up on a little black box. So. Unless you want me to point it at you. I mean, need to know you're here.
Sorry if I accidentally, people are now being too helpful. I know, just letting a few more people in. And folks, as you're joining us, if you can mute yourselves as you come in, it'd be really helpful. Great. All right, so mute people. All right, so we're going to get started. So I want to thank everybody for coming and welcome everybody for coming to this presentation. We have a lot of new folks who are joining us, a lot from some of the Pacific Theater and World War II sites, and welcome. We're really excited to have you. And we do want to be doing more World War II presentations and more about the Pacific Theater. And you'll see at the end of the presentation, we're going to announce some stuff that we have coming up. But I want to get right to it because Brad has a lot of amazing information to share with us and beautiful photographs. So I want to introduce Bradley Sheard. He is a diver photographer based out of Maryland. He works with DV Tenacious on a number of projects and has worked with Joe and the crew for years, has traveled all over the world photographing wrecks. And he's going to talk today about Guadalcanal and the ghostly guns of Iron Bottom Sound. So I'm going to turn it over to him to kick things off.
All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'd like to show you today is what I guess I've titled Ghostly Guns of Iron Bottom Sound in Guadalcanal. This opening spread is actually from a magazine article I did in 2011. Used without permission, but since I wrote it and took the picture, I figured that's okay. So let's jump in. So where's Guadalcanal? So I've got a series of maps up here. In the upper right, you can see a map of the South Pacific region. You see Australia here, and the Solomon Island chain is here. We zoom in a little bit. See, Guadalcanal Island is this big island here, and north of it is the Florida Island group with a bunch of little islands, volcanic island of Savo. And if we zoom in there again, you see this is the Florida Islands, Guadalcanal, Savo Island. And these numbers all represent shipwrecks that were sunk during World War II. So what I've got listed here, just gonna move that out of the way, are 43 wrecks plotted on this one plot here. Most of the water here is very deep. The sound itself is on the order of 3,000 feet deep. So the wrecks that we get to dive tend to be around the edges. So what is Guadalcanal? Guadalcanal was basically a vicious 6-month campaign of land, sea, and air forces during World War II that takes place in the South Pacific. So many ships were sunk in these waters that the sailors themselves who served here named the place Iron Bottom Sound, because there was so much iron sunk. The air, sea, and land battles fought in Guadalcanal have become legendary synonyms for both the horror of war and victory through sheer guts and perseverance. Allied losses in this 6-month campaign were amounted to 29 ships, almost 1,600 Army and Marines killed in action. And really, as far as I can tell, there is no accounting of how many naval personnel were actually lost. Japanese losses were much higher, 40 ships, almost 15,000 land forces. They also don't seem to have an accurate accounting of naval personnel. Because you're in the tropics here, it's not just the war, it was also a lot of disease, dysentery and malaria. And for the Japanese in particular, they had severe food shortages. And so the Japanese, I've seen it referred to in their history as Starvation Island. Now I've named this is based on, a lot of what I'm going to show here is one of my favorite books on this subject, and there are quite a few. The Struggle for Guadalcanal, which is by Samuel Eliot Morison. He wrote a 15-part series on the history of the US Navy during World War II. Volume 5 is entirely dedicated to Guadalcanal. And I'm going to quote him a few times because he has some magnificent quotes that I'm going to use here. Okay, why are we not going? Okay, so let's take a step back and see, where does Guadalcanal as a campaign fit into the overall World War II timeline? So this is basically an abbreviated timeline of World War II. Of course, December 7th, 1941, the Pacific War begins with a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. 10 days later, which is another interesting story that we're not going to cover here, the Japanese sink the Prince of Wales and Repulse in the South China Sea by airplane. From December through May 1942, there's this massive Japanese expansion. The Philippines, Guam, Burma, Borneo, Rabaul, Bougainville, Java, Singapore, all fall into Japanese hands. And there's many more that I'm not mentioning, but they basically expanded into all of Southeast Asia and the South Pacific in their attempt to not only take over some of that area, but provide themselves a buffer zone to keep basically us and our allies out of their hair, if you will. What I've highlighted in orange here are things that we'll cover today. May 3rd and 4th, before we invaded Guadalcanal, there are a couple wrecks you can dive because the Japanese landed on Tulagi in the Florida Islands and established a seaplane base. And the next day, the USS Yorktown, as part of the Coral Sea campaign, attacked those Japanese forces by aircraft attack. Then comes the Battle of the Coral Sea, threw in here the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. And of course, in June 1942, that massive Battle of Midway, which really turned the tide of the Pacific War, where Americans sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. But this was only a naval battery. No territory changed hands in this thing. So it really didn't stop the expansion of the Japanese Empire. On July 4th and 5th, the Allies discovered the Japanese were building an airfield on Guadalcanal. And only a month later, they mounted an invasion of Guadalcanal and Tulagi. And 6 months later, the Japanese secretly evacuate from Guadalcanal. And of course, the rest of the war follows after that. Okay, so this is another timeline. There won't be a lot of timelines here, but these are all the events that I'd like to cover tonight. Those highlighted in blue are events that we have shipwrecks that we can dive from, that are in diveable depths, okay? So in May, as I mentioned, the Japanese land on Tulagi. The Allies discovered a Japanese airfield, got the Allied invasion of Guadalcanal, a series of sea battles, an untold number of land battles on the Marines. I'm not going to cover everything today. This is an abbreviated list as it is. So rather than go through this list, we'll move forward to the next slide. So before we even invade Guadalcanal, we get to go diving. This is the steepest shipwreck we dove when we were there. It sits in 250 foot of water, or about 76 meters. This is a minesweep, Japanese minesweeper called a Tamamaru. It sunk off a little island just off the beach, but because all these islands drop rapidly in depth, it sits in 250 foot of water. The dive guide had to go pay the landowner adjacent to here permission to dive it. You have to pay him a little fee sometimes. It's the way their territory works. So the Yorktown came in and attacked what was building a seaplane base that the Japanese had begun building in Tulagi, which is part of the Florida Island group. They sank the destroyer Kikuzuki, minesweeper Tamamaru, which you see here, and a couple other auxiliary minesweepers. Well, this is the best picture I could find of Tamamaru, and I don't even know how good it is. It's a little steal from the internet, quite honestly. But this Shepherd, it's a little one, but it lies on it. So you can see it's on its port side. Here's the stern. Still got a prop and rudder there. A view from directly astern, canted over. The visibility on this wreck was just remarkable. If we saw up on the upper left, we swim up to the bow. You can see the bow actually sits upright, and it's got all this sort of fluffy. I'm guessing this is a black coral, but I don't know 100% sure. And then some machinery. Another view of the wreck there, and then the stern here, which you've got all this thing. I always wonder what these corrugated hoses are in here. I really have no idea. I just didn't see them until I had the picture. So, also we just sank the destroyer Kikuzuki. This is the shallowest wreck we dove because we didn't actually dive. You can actually walk on what's left of the deck. You can see on the upper left, you've got pictures of it after it was bombed in shallow water and being salvaged by the Japanese, or I guess as we came in. These were taken in August 1943. So it was after we invaded. And you can see what's left here. This is Yoda and I believe Matt Walters on the deck. You can see a gun barrel still lying on the deck, and a gun mount in the upper right here. So in early July, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. ordered Operation Watchtower, which at that time was destined to be the seizure and occupation of New Britain, New Ireland, and New Guinea, and in that area. However, a few days later, an Allied reconnaissance plane reported that the Japanese had begun to build an airfield on Guadalcanal Island. This was deemed so vitally important to the supply lines to Australia, because basically the Japanese could have bombed any shipping sent to Australia from the United States, that the mission was changed, the operation was changed to be the seizure of Tulagi and Guadalcanal. And less than a month later, we invaded Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and two small islands, Gavutu and Tanambogo. I hope I'm pronouncing these right, I'm not sure. These are some aerial reconnaissance photos that are about that time. You can see they're annotated. They came out of the National Archives. You can see this is Guadalcanal Island here. And you can see this airstrip that Japanese had begun to build. This is really what got the attention of the United States for this island, because otherwise nobody would have wanted the island of Guadalcanal, at least from a war perspective. The middle picture is an aerial photograph of Tulagi on the Florida Island group. You can see it's annotated with beach blue and a bunch of other things. And on the right is Tanambogo and Gavutu, which were these are very small but very flat islands with a causeway between them. And they were had a lot of headquarters and staff type buildings there. So on August 7th and 8th, the Allies consisted largely of United States forces, but also New Zealand and Australians. They sailed into the Sound and took the Japanese completely by surprise. They came into this pass here. About 11,000 Marines went into Guadalcanal, and the remainder up to Tulagi. Amphibious landing put 19,000 Marines on those two islands. The airfield was taken almost completely unopposed. It was mostly construction crews, and they shelled the beach first, and most of the Japanese kind of fled into the jungle. There was, however, fierce resistance on Tulagi and the other two islands, and many Marines were killed, but many more Japanese. In fact, this is one of the, I guess the first, I think, is it the first? I think it's certainly one of the first amphibious operations in the Pacific by the Allies. And it kind of set the tone for what was to come, whereas the Japanese would basically fight to almost the last man and just would not give up. The Japanese continued to mount air attacks during the entire invasion, mostly from bases up in Rabaul. They did sink the destroyer Jarvis, the US destroyer Jarvis, and a transport George F. Elliott, which you see burning here. And you can see the island here of Kavutu or Tanambogo in the lower left, burning from air attacks, from Allied air attacks. This is the George Eliot burning. This ship is believed to be in diveable waters, and I believe she has not been found yet, though people are looking. So fearing more air attacks, the commander of the Allied carrier forces decides to withdraw his forces. So he basically takes out all air support for the operation before it's complete. So we can dive a couple wrecks here in the harbor behind Tulagi is where the Japanese had started their seaplane base. And there were 7 Mavis flying boats and 8 float zeros were moored. And 16 Wildcats from the Wasp conducted an air raid and sank every one of them. Now, we never did get to dive one of the float zeros, but we did fly 3 or 4 of the flying boats, which are really pretty neat wrecks for airplanes. You see on the left, this is an upside down flying boat. There were 4-engine plane. The wing is upside down. You can see the float in the background and the prop on there. On the right is a different airplane. This one's upright. You can see this is the cockpit region. Matt Walters behind it. You can see the Solomons are known for fabulous coral growth. And on these shallower wrecks, these are only 80 to 100 foot deep. Everything gets covered in just gorgeous coral for anyone interested in reefs. Here are a few more pictures of those airplanes. We've got the skeletal remains of the horizontal stabilizer and vertical fin or rudder. I'm an aircraft engineer, or used to be before I retired, so I can understand this. This is all the structure that was under the skins. Here you got a couple more engines on the wing, one, and you can see a faint one in the background. Another float, pontoon float underneath the wing. You can see the supporting struts. And inside the cockpit, you can see you've got these marvelous schools of these little glassy fish that kind of make it a little difficult to photograph because they tend to be like a lot of mirrors little swimming around. So August 9th. Now we only invaded on the 7th. We spent a couple days trying to unload cargo and take the islands. The first defeat comes on the night of August 9th, Battle of Savo Island. As we'll see, the Japanese were highly trained in night action and naval night action, far superior to the Allies at this time. So they mounted a surprise attack. And they caught us napping, basically. They sent a force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer down the slot from their bases up in Rabaul. They basically came down, did a turn around Savo Island, and left. Their mission was to attack the transports as they were unloading, but they never got to do that. Instead, they sank 4 Allied cruisers in the course of about an hour or so, and 1,270 sailors lost their lives. We had the USS Quincy. This is a picture taken. The Quincy was illuminated by Japanese spotlights. 370 men were lost when she went down. USS Vincennes sunk, 332 men lost. USS Astoria, 219 men were lost. The Australian cruiser Canberra was also so heavily damaged that in the morning, they were able to evacuate most of her crew. Here you see a destroyer unloading her, she burns, and then pictures as she rolls over and sinks. The remainder of the Allied naval forces now decide to withdraw. Unfortunately, they had not finished unloading all the Marine supplies. So basically, the Marines were left ashore with only 37 days of supplies, and all their naval support had left. So they kind of left them on their own on this jungle island. Now, the objective of this entire campaign in the Pacific, because this is just a malaria-infested jungle island in the South Pacific that really has no strategic, it had strategic significance in that it was an ideal location for an airfield. The Japanese had begun building this airfield. You can see in the upper left, this was an aerial view in August 1942 when we first invaded. The Japanese had basically plowed a flat plain here and it wasn't operational yet. So it was partially completed. The US Marines or Allied Marines finished the field and made it operational in only 10 days. A lot of it using abandoned Japanese equipment because they not and it hadn't all been unloaded from the transports. The field was named Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, who was killed during the Battle of Midway, just a few weeks earlier, in essence. And this became known as the Cactus Air Force. Cactus was the original code name for Guadalcanal, and that's where the name Cactus Air Force comes from. On August 20th, the small escort carrier Long Island delivered the first load of airplanes, 19 Wildcats and 12 Dauntless. Now, in the lower right, you see a Wildcat, a Grumman Wildcat. The reason I mention that is I spent a lot of my career working for Grumman Aircraft Company, working on different fighters. So the Wildcat has sort of a special meaning to me. And I would love to find one and dive the wreckage of a Wildcat from somewhere in the Solomons. So if we take a step back and look at these are the basic tactics of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, which runs for about 6 months. The Allies hold the airfield, Tulagi and Florida Islands. That allows them to have control of both the sea and the air during daylight hours. Japanese, however, are superb night fighters, and they train for this in their Navy. So there was this fascinating thing where control of the sea would switch hands every 12 hours. Once night fell, the Japanese reigned supreme. Their objective in the entire campaign is to retake the airfield and drive the Allies out of the entire theater. What they developed is a supply route where you see on the left here, you've got this, they run troops and supplies by fast destroyer down the slot at night. They would leave in the day, come down slot so that they arrived here at night so that their allies couldn't control the sky with the airplanes because they're all grounded at night for the most part. Drop off their supplies and then head up and get far enough up the slot where once daylight warned, they'd be out of aircraft range. One of the things that worked in the Allies' favor is the Japanese seemed to continually underestimate the strength of how many troops we had on the island. We landed with 19,000. They only had a few thousand at the time, but they kept trying to deliver more. A few weeks later, toward the end of August, there's a big fleet action north of the Solomon Islands. This one's called the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The Japanese plan is to land 1,500 men on Guadalcanal, which is foiled. But because of the airplanes, this is before they started running at night. But they did manage to send in ships and bombard the airfield for 2 consecutive nights with naval guns. And there were also continually, like almost daily air attacks on the airfield as the Japanese continually tried to knock out the airfield. But you notice the thing that the Japanese tried to land 1,500 men. Well, there's 10 times that many allies on Guadalcanal. And that's part of their underestimating the force all the time. Planes from the USS Saratoga sink the Japanese light carrier Ryuju, and I don't know that I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Enterprise is damaged by a Japanese aircraft. The Japanese carrier was sent out as bait, though. It was sent up, I believe, over here. They were trying to bait the Allies into attacking that so that they could then find our fleet carriers, but they never did, fortunately for us. Now, there were almost continuous land battles between Japanese forces and Allied forces. I'm not going to cover them all. They're incredibly numerous. The one I chose to put here is the Battle of Bloody Ridge, also known as Edson Ridge, which is kind of legendary, I guess. So the Japanese had forces both to the east and to the west of the airfield. This is the airfield. This is the perimeter that the Marines had established. So they knew this attack was coming through intelligence, and I guess it was Mr. Edson. I'm sorry, I don't know his rank offhand. He correctly guessed that the Japanese would attack through Bloody Ridge, which is this high ridge you see here. Here you see it in a contemporary photograph, and this is a modern one when we visited it. So as combined with that were furious night attacks on the ridge with air and sea bombardments, coordinated attacks on the airfield from both the east and the west. And the Japanese just also on their land forces, they really were very keen on attacking at night. And this was touch and go for a while, but in the end, the Marines held the ridge, repelled the attack on the airfield. At the cost of 40 US Marines, 633 Japanese were killed. As an interesting side note, the first year we went in 2006, Matt Walters, we spent 9 days land-based diving a lot of the wrecks, and then Matt Walters and I hopped on a liveaboard, the Spirit of the Solomons, to go do some reef diving. And in the day between, Matt and I got this gentleman here, which was John Innes, who was an ex-Australian Marine, to give us this incredible World War II tour of the island, in which case he drove us up many places. This guy knew the history of like every foxhole on the island. And I'm not kidding. He'd point to a foxhole, which was a ditch, and tell us the whole story of who was in that foxhole and what happened. He was incredibly knowledgeable. But as he takes us up here in his little car on some dirt road, and he parks it, as we're walking out onto the ridge, he says, "Oh, yeah, we got to be careful. There's stories of somebody stealing cameras out of people's tourist vehicles up here." And just as he says that, Matt Walters goes, "Yeah, there he is." And sure enough, we turn around, there's some kid trying to sneak up on our car. So we run back, chase the kid off. We're good. Well, the next thing we know, the kid is back with his buddy. And I'll tell you, when you're on the end of a well-thrown stone, this guy was throwing stones about the size of a softball. He took out 3 windows in the car we were driving before we were able to get out of there. And so there's this clip here in the lower mid is a clip out of the Solomon Star newspaper. American tourists attacked. Well, this was about Matt Walters and I on the ridge. That's sort of unfortunately, as an embarrassment to the US Marines, Matt and I lost the second battle of Bloody Ridge because we were driven off of it. The beginning of October comes another major sea battle, the Battle of Cape Esperance. This is a night sea battle between US cruiser and destroyer forces and Japanese cruisers and destroyers. Supported by the US carrier Hornet, we lose 1 destroyer, they lose 3 destroyers and a cruiser. And all these ships were sunk along with a lot of men. You can see this is in just east of Savo Island here. That's followed almost immediately by what came to be called the bombardment. The Japanese sent battleships into the Sound at night, and they conducted a brutal 2-hour bombardment of the airfield. And they lofted almost 1,000 14-inch shells into the airfield, basically trying to just destroy the airfield, because that again was what's keeping them out of the waters here during daylight hours. At the same time, they've got Japanese daylight bombing attacks, and they send 6 supply transports down the slot to try and resupply and reinforce their troops on the island, all aimed at trying to retake this airfield. They took out about half the planes that were stationed at Guadalcanal, burned up most of the aviation fuel, killed a bunch of people, obviously. Yet the Marines managed to scrape together enough gasoline to get some planes flying the next morning, as well as some planes that came out of the Espirito Santo. They actually siphoned gas out of wrecked airplanes to try and put together enough aviation fuel to get planes aloft. So the 6 transports that the Japanese sent down, 3 of them were sunk right off the beach: the Azuma-san Maru, the Kyushu Maru, and the Saseko Maru. The other 3 were forced to withdraw by the air attacks before they completely unloaded their cargo. So the Azuma-san Maru is a fabulous wreck that sits off the beach. A lot of these wrecks that were beached, these Japanese transports, tend to sit on a slope. In this case, the bow sits in about 130 foot of water, and the stern is in 250, and I put a plus here. I don't know how deep the stern is. It could be down to 280 or 300. I never got all the way to the stern. We were diving mostly air when we were there. The only person that had any helium was Karen, because Karen Flynn had a rebreather. She was the only one. And Neil, our dive guy that you can see here. The rest of us had to dive air, and that's just what you had. It was too expensive to get helium into the Solomon Islands. It's still a problem. I think Neil told us at the time it would take 3 months and $1,500 a bottle to get helium shipped in from Australia. So it's kind of off limits, other than nowadays with the rebreather, of course, you have a different story. So on the left, you've got Neil posing next to the bow of this ship. You can get in on the far right is a small deck gun that's perched up on the bow, covered in this fabulous Solomon Islands coral. And you can get into the holds. The holds are mostly empty, but there is a little bit of scattering of cargo. And Neil here is posing over a motorcycle. Now, I don't know exactly why you wanted a motorcycle in Guadalcanal Island, since it was mostly jungle. Which I guess there's one road down the beach, but that's sitting in the cargo hold. Here are some more shots up in the bow. Neil swimming through some of the cargo holds. Has these big H masts that if you've ever been to truck, you're familiar with. All the cargo ships had these big masts for unloading cargo. And a few more views. It's a pretty neat dive. We only got to dive it twice. There's a lot of deck equipment and ladders and guns on the outside. This one in the middle, I think, is a boat davit that's retracted. But the cargo holds tend to be empty. And since we were diving air at the time, we never got back to the stern. I know Neil did, and Karen might have gotten back there. I'm not sure. But if we ever go back, there are some deeper wrecks that would be neat to dive on a rebreather. Toward the end of October, third week in October, comes what came to be known as the Battle for Henderson Field. Intended to be a major Japanese coordinated attack on the airfield. So the Japanese who are now stationed to the west of, this is the airfield and its perimeter. Japanese are stationed off to the west, and they're going to attempt this coordinated attack from both the west, and they sent a set of forces to hack their way through the jungle and so they could attack from the south. The problem was that they misunderstood or did not quite understand how difficult the terrain was, hacking your way through the jungle of Guadalcanal. And these forces were delayed, which upset the whole coordination of this attack. In the end, the attack failed, largely because of the coordination was messed up. There were a lot of casualties in this one, though, over 200 US Marines, and the quote seems to be thousands of Japanese were killed in these failed attacks. What I boxed in green here is, this is what I like, this is one of the things that fascinates me when you get into diving and history. This is like this sort of cross-link in history. If any of you have ever had the chance to go to Vanuatu and dive the wreck of the President Coolidge. President Coolidge was loaded with equipment and infantry intended to reinforce the garrison on Guadalcanal. And there's a footnote in Samuel Eliot Morrison's book, basically saying that when this ship sank, it hit a friendly minefield and sank with all its equipment. It for weeks delayed the reinforcement of Guadalcanal and had a serious impact on the operations there. And these are pictures that were taken inside the holds of some of that cargo inside the President Coolidge. So it's kind of fascinating sometimes how these different areas you think of as isolated. I'll go to Vanuatu or I'll go to the Solomons. Now they're all interrelated and it all fits together in this big picture. So right on the heels of that failed attack is another huge fleet action to the north of the Solomons or the northeast of the Solomons. This was a fleet action with 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and 2 US aircraft carriers. This was part of the coordinated attack. They were supposed to take the land forces were supposed to take the airfield at the same time that the Japanese, and they use this word, their intention was to annihilate remaining Allied forces. They failed to take the airfield. They failed to annihilate the fleet, though we did lose the carrier Hornet and the destroyer USS Porter. Then comes about a almost 3-week layover And keep in mind, there are constant air attacks and jungle warfare. Now comes a naval battle of Guadalcanal. This is perhaps the major sea battle of Guadalcanal campaign. The battle that rages for 3 days and nights. In the end, 26 ships were sunk. The Japanese send 11 high-speed transports of reinforcements of Marines, along with a battleship group intended to bombard Henderson Field yet again. The US gets wind of this by intelligence and coast watchers and sends their fleet to intercept. Americans have the advantage of radar, but it's rudimentary radar. It's often misinterpreted and it's not great. Japanese don't have radar, but they're much better at night fleet actions. What follows is this confused, hectic night action. And when dawn comes, there's 8 crippled ships floating around Iron Bottom Sound, and 9 ships have been sunk. And here I have a quote from Samuel Eliot Morison, who actually was involved in a lot of campaigns in the Pacific during the war. He didn't just write this history afterwards, but he visited or was involved in a lot of these campaigns. The way he described this night action: literally infernal scene presented itself to the participants. The struggle had deteriorated into a wild and desperate melee. The greenish light of suspended star shell dimmed the stars overhead. Elongated red and white trails of shell tracers arched and crisscrossed. Magazines exploded in blinding bouquets of white flame. Oil-fed conflagrations sent up twisted yellow columns, dotting the horizon with the dulled red glows of smoldering hulls, now obscured by dense masses of smoke, now blazing up when uncontrolled fires reached new combustibles. The sea itself, fouled with oil and flotsam, tortured by underwater upheavals, rose in geysers from shell explosions. This is just night one. The following day and night, the Japanese are completely determined to continue with their mission. They send a new group of 6 cruisers and 6 destroyers into the Sound to once again bombard Henderson Field. Meanwhile, they also send 11 transports with supplies guarded by 11 destroyers down the slot, trying to reinforce their land forces so that they can, once again, their entire objective is to retake the airfield. Planes from Henderson Field, USS Enterprise, and also from Espiritu Santo, which is Vanuatu, if you haven't been there. They find and attack the Japanese transport force. So here's Guadalcanal, and this is where the transport battle took place. They managed to sink 7 out of the 11 transports. November 14th to 15th comes yet another night action between Japanese and American battleships. This is almost like the Battle of Jutland, but taken at night. USS South Dakota and the Japanese battleship Kirishima are heavily damaged. Kirishima is abandoned and scuttled. 4 Japanese transports are grounded on the beach trying to desperately get the remaining supplies to their Marines ashore. Planes from Henderson Field, when daylight dawns, find these transports on the beach, and they bomb and strafe them for an entire day. Just
Did you mute him?
Brad, you have to unmute. Sorry.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me now? All right. How much did I miss? I don't know how I did that.
Like one sentence. It was my fault. I was letting somebody in and I accidentally hit mute.
Oh, okay, good. We're good to go then. Okay. So the Japanese beach their 4 transports on the beach. And in the morning, the Cactus Air Force finds them and bombs and strafes them for an entire day, pretty much destroying the ships. And all 4 ships become a total loss to the Japanese. At the end of this 3-day battle, the Japanese have only delivered about 2,000 troops to reinforce their Marines and limited supplies. Henderson Field is still operational and still in Allied hands. As Samuel Eliot Morison writes, the conclusion of this great battle was marked by a definitive shift of the Americans from the defensive to the offensive, and of the Japanese in the opposite direction. On the right-hand side, you see these are the names and ship types of 26 ships that were lost. So you've got two anti-aircraft cruisers and Allied, the Juno and Atlanta, and I don't know what is that? 1, 2, 3, 6, 7 destroyers. Japanese lose 2 battleships, a cruiser, destroyers, and a whole slew of transports that were intended to reinforce their Marines. Now, USS Juno is a famous ship. It's particularly famous. This is an anti-aircraft cruiser, actually. It was set up for anti-aircraft protection. It was actually heavily damaged during the night battle, but as it was leaving the scene the following day, it was torpedoed by a Japanese sub and sent to the bottom. It's famous in particular because serving on board were 5 brothers, five Sullivan brothers, and almost the entire complement, 673 men were lost. There were only 10 survivors from this torpedoing. And the 5 Sullivan brothers were among those lost. And I believe that after this, because of what happened here, the Navy prohibited siblings from serving together on the same ship because this was such a tragic loss for the family. Now, I borrowed some pictures. Paul Allen in his RV Petrel discovered the wreck of the Juno on March 17, 2018. The only reason I felt comfortable taking these pictures is they're available for download at www.navsource.org, which is a fabulous resource for U.S. Navy ships. You can find almost any Navy ship and find all historical photos and download them. And what I discovered is, oh, look, there's these 2 underwater pictures of the Juno that Paul Allen found. So I said, okay, maybe it's okay to use these. I'm not publishing them. I'm just going to use them in a presentation. So you see an anti-aircraft gun tub on the right and one of the big anti-aircraft turrets on the left. I'm just so jealous of the visibility you seem to get at these depths, because this wreck is sitting in 13,800 feet of water. So we'll never be diving this one. But there are some we can dive from the naval battle of Guadalcanal. In particular, two of the Japanese transports which were beached. They were literally run up on the beach. On the left, you can see an SPD Dauntless flying the following day. You can see these 2 pillars of smoke in the background, 3 actually. These are some of the transports that they bombed. Here's another aerial view showing 2 of the ships that we get to dive, the Hirakawa Maru and the Kinagawa Maru. And another picture later in the war of the Kinagawa Maru run up on the beach. When you go to this wreck site, you actually dive it from the beach. And you can see here, the engine still sticks out of the water. And on the right, you see this is actually a shot looking up at the engine from underwater. There was this huge sea anemone growing on the base of it and a little clownfish there. And it's looking up towards the sun. So you see this top part is out of the water and then this part is submerged. And I like this picture at the very top. You see, here's the wreck with Savo Island in the background, which is this sort of iconic view that I think the sailors learned to hate who served here. And some native kids swimming off the beach in the foreground. Here's some more views of the Kinagawa Maru. Now these are kind of fascinating because they were beached, the bow's up on the beach, literally out of water in this case. The stern sits in 85 foot of water. So you swim back to the stern. You can see the rudder here and a school of fish that was always hanging out underneath the stern. And then you kind of work your way up. You can go through cargo holds, see ladders and coral growth, and it gets shallower and shallower. And the shallower it gets, the more color you get from the coral. This comes into play in particular when we dive the other wreck, the Hirakawa Maru. She sits, her stern is in 185 foot of water, or 56 meters. So the first thing you do is you swim all the way down to the stern to the deep part, do your deep stuff first. So here's the fantail. And on the other side where the diver is, there's a stern deck gun covered in coral. And then you kind of work your way back up towards the shallows. On the way, you can explore the cargo holes and you sort of get more and more color. And at the same time, you're getting shallower. So you're kind of starting to get your decompression in. You end up doing your decompression in the shallows in maybe 20 foot of water, exploring the wrecks, or actually diving the wreck as you decompress. And some of the coral growth is fabulous on these wrecks. Here you can see a diver exploring a largely empty cargo hold And she's on her side, so you see the big H mast sticking out horizontally. And as you get shallower again, you get more and more of the coral, particularly you look at all these beautiful soft corals you see in the shallow portion. And there's some bits of cargo in the hold. I really couldn't recognize what this stuff was, but it makes good foreground subject for a photographer. You kind of shoot the equipment looking out towards the open water, makes a nice picture. But the coral growth is really fabulous here. And these two wrecks, if you ever go on to do reef diving in the Solomons and go on either the Spirit of the Solomons or the Billikiki, they'll actually take you. These are two of the wrecks that they'll actually take you to because they're pretty shallow. And they're pretty nice dives, but you can also do them off the beach. Battle of Tassafaronga. At the end of November comes yet another. This is the last major sea battle of the Guadalcanal campaign. Once again, it's a night action. The Japanese are desperate to supply their ground forces, so they come up with a new tactic. They send destroyers down the slot. They pack their supplies into drums, picture oil drums, or 55-gallon drums. And the idea is they tow them down and they just dump them off the beach in the water, and then the Marines are going to try and come out and pick these up. That way they don't actually have to stop and risk their ships. They're doing this at night. Unfortunately for the Allies, they get wind of this, and even though they picked up the Japanese on radar, they failed to open fire quickly enough. The Japanese had superb torpedoes. They launched, I don't know, something like 40-something torpedoes at Allied forces. They sink the cruiser Northampton. They blow the bows off both the Minneapolis and New Orleans, and they severely damaged the Pensacola. The Japanese only lost one destroyer in this action. Now, what's fascinating of this is the story of the USS Minneapolis. You can see on the left here, she was torpedoed and she lost 60 foot of her bow. But it's not actually there. You can see this steel plate here. She actually made it into Tulagi under her own power. They cut the bow off and they plugged up the hole with coconut logs, repaired her, and then they managed to sail her first to Espiritu Santo, then Pearl Harbor, and finally to the US West Coast, where she was rebuilt and she returned to the war before it was over. And you can actually dive. They cut all this stuff off and dumped it in the back of Tulagi Harbor. So there's this wonderful rummage dive in the back in about 50 foot of water, where there's actually all this wreckage cut from the Minneapolis. Here you can, the upper left, you can see Neil Yates. He's posing in front of what appears to be, to me, the hawse pipe of a big hunk of the bow that they cut off and let drop to the bottom. In the lower left, there's a anchor. This is not the anchor one here. You can see this is much smaller. So I'm not sure what it was from, but it's sitting in its own hawse pipe of some sort. There's all this wreckage scattered around the side, including a ton of shells. There's shells and cordite lying all over the bottom. You just kind of move from piece to piece, trying to be careful not to stir it up. It's pretty silty down there. Viz isn't the best, but it's really fascinating dive. So Samuel Morrison writes, and I chose this because it's a rather dramatic description to me. Tassafaronga, last major sea battle in the arena of the Southern Solomons, ended 4 months of vicious hull-to-hull slugging, the like of which neither the Americans nor the Japanese had ever seen. No man who fought in those bloody waters can forget the apprehension, the exultations, and the terror that he experienced, the hideous forms of death that he witnessed, or the self-sacrificing heroism that gave him a new respect for his fellow seamen. Savo, Guadalcanal, Tassafaronga, and the rest are no mere battle names to the survivors. They are flaming banners of deathless deeds by ships and men whose bones forever rest in Iron Bottom Sound. At this point in the war, the Japanese have come to the conclusion they cannot drive the Marines out of and regain the airfield. So they decide to mount a secret operation that they named KE to evacuate all their personnel by destroyer. And over the course of a week, I think it was occurred over 3 separate nights, They evacuated over 11,000 men by sending destroyers down the slot, picking them up and running back up. This was kept entirely secret from the Allies. They had no idea that they knew something was going on. They had no idea the Japanese were withdrawing. Subsequent Allied marine advances along the coast and through the jungle eventually discovered the Japanese had left. They found only abandoned equipment, bases, food, etc. This ends the Guadalcanal campaign proper. And the 29 Allied ships and 40 Japanese ships were lost fighting over this jungle island that nobody really wanted in the long run, only because of its strategic location. But Japanese, so the Allies now own Guadalcanal and Tulagi, but the Japanese, doesn't mean the Japanese are just going to not harass us. They continue to send air bombing attacks and air bombers coming down from Naval, Bougainville, and later on Munda, I believe, down the slot to harass and bomb Allied forces. On April 7th, 1943, they mounted a massive aerial attack against Tulagi and Guadalcanal. 67 Val dive bombers and 110 Zero fighters are sent down the slot. Allies lose. They managed to sink the destroyer USS Aaron Ward, a fleet tanker USS Kanawha, and a New Zealand corvette Moa, which you can see pictured here. This is actually a plot of the after-action report on USS Aaron Ward. She was bombed over off the coast of here, tried to beach herself up here, and was eventually sank. These are three of the best wrecks you can dive there, actually, and we'll get into these now. So the New Zealand corvette Moa is sunken in back of Tulagi Harbor. It sits in about 138 foot of water. This is kind of hit or miss, but it's really a pretty interesting dive. It sits upright. It's fairly intact. It can be a little bit silty. Here you see Karen Flynn shining her light inside to help me out in this shot. And in this green box, we've got another one of these sort of cross links in history, I like to call them. The Moa, which is sunk on April 7th, only 6 weeks or so, 5 or 6 weeks earlier, had teamed up with a sister ship, Kiwi, both New Zealand corvettes, and sank the Japanese submarine I-1. They actually were depth charging her repeatedly and eventually drove her up on a reef. So this historical picture here is of the stern of the submarine I-1, grounded, sticking out of the water as she grounded on a reef. And we actually got to dive this. There's not a whole lot left of it, but these pictures here on the Japanese submarine I-1. So 5 or 6 weeks later, Moa herself gets sunk by the Japanese. Here you see some more views. There's a deck gun near the stern. Up in the upper left here, set of depth charge racks on the stern. Here's an anti-aircraft gun, still pointed at the sky. Karen Flynn's doing a little lighting for me here on the interior. You can get inside a bit of it. She's kind of broken down, but she's really quite intact. This is a pretty nice dive, and it's one of the at a fairly reasonable depth. USS Kanawha was a fleet oiler. It's a pretty old one. She was also sunk during the attack. She now sits in about 200 foot of water or 60 meters. 19 men were lost when she went down. So here in the upper right, you see a picture of her burning furiously. You don't want to be on a tanker when you get hit by aircraft bombs. What's fascinating to me, the pictures along the bottom it's almost like someone was trying to shoot a panorama that we would do today. Today you kind of take your iPhone and do a panorama shot. Well, whoever took these back in 1943 took 3 shots. You can see her bow, her midship section, and her stern as she's burning furiously. Presumably this is when they evacuated the sailors who survived it. But this is a fascinating dive. She sits upright on the bottom. Big ship, bristling with anti-aircraft guns. On the upper left, you see, here's a shot of the bow. I'm actually down at the very foot of the bow looking up. You can see the outline of her bow. And here's a historical picture of that same bow when she was launched. What's really fascinating here to me is See this big, this buckle here. And if you, here's a close-up of the bow. Her actual stem is buckled in this crazy configuration, which I presume must have happened when she hit the bottom. It must have, the force of hitting the bottom must have driven that up and literally buckled the stem of the ship. In the middle, you see one of her anchors. I think there might be 3 anchors on this. You can only see 2 here, but I think there's actually 3. Set of high pressure cylinders still intact. I don't know if there's gas in them. They haven't blown up. Some portholes on the bridge, an anti-aircraft gun. And here you see Yoda, Charles Richardson, if you're listening. He's trying to uphold, he's got his hands around the letter K. You can barely make out K. You can see she had her name, apparently brass letters spelled across her stern, Cano. It's unfortunate, you can't really see it very well, but he's got his hands on that letter K. This is, you could spend a lot of time exploring this wreck. I don't know how many dives we did. We dove over both trips we went. There's a lot to see inside. There's a lot to see outside. Here's the bow, the forepeak of the bow, bunch of views inside. Was a whole room of collapsed wooden crates. Part of the engine room where you can see the catwalks are falling down. And Neil Yates, who was our dive guide, took us on this fabulous tour. He knew his way around inside this place, but it was kind of silty, and you get to train a diver. It gets a little tough to do photography, but this reminds me of the wrecks you see in truck. You know, in the upper left, this is what looks like a lathe to me, although I don't know if it is. Storage container, a big pot, probably in a galley or something. I have no idea what this thing in the lower right is. It's fascinating thing. I think Neil probably told us what they were, but it was so long ago I don't remember. But you could really spend some time inside there. And on the stern itself, again, she's bristling with anti-aircraft guns, not that they helped her. On the right is one of the midships anti-aircraft guns with Neil posing by it. On the stern is this wonderful circular gun tub. So I actually stuck a camera on a tripod here and took a series of shots and stitched them together in a panorama. And you can see, because it's not just the anti-aircraft gun, but over on the right here, you see these cases of ready ammunition. You can see highlighted, you know, some other shots in color down below. And there's actually shells still sticking out of the holder here. So the crown jewel of diving in Guadalcanal, however, has to be the USS Aaron Ward. So in a way, we're saving the best to last, but we're actually just going in historical order here, chronological order. Aaron Ward was a Cleves-class destroyer, sunk in this aircraft attack. This on the right is a bomb damage diagram that I found online. It's dated April 1943. So this was some kind of assessment. I'm a little suspicious because it's in color, but may have been annotated later, I don't know. So this is the USS Aaron Ward. She sits upright on the bottom and is just the most noticeable and memorable thing to me is just these 5-inch gun turrets, and they're still all pointing up at the sky. You look at the one in the middle, and that is just pointing almost as high as it can go, as is the anti-aircraft gun in the foreground. So, I mean, she literally went down in action, and the guns are pointing up at the attackers, the Japanese aircraft coming in, which eventually sank her. In the upper right, you see you can stick a camera inside an open door on the turret, and it's just littered with shell casings lying all over the place in there. The bow on the left, you can see she went down and hit a reef, and both the bow and the stern. This is the bow. You can see it's bent upward. The deck is literally buckled, presumably from hitting this reef or settling down over the years. It's kind of interesting. Midships is this wonderful searchlight iris. It looks like the iris from a camera lens, all overgrown with coral. And in the background is the stack. And on the right, you see the remains of the bridge, which is partly fallen over, and the gun director, the central gun director here on the center, which is completely fallen over. And these, I think, are the rangefinders for sighting the guns and coordinated control. More midships, more views midships in the top center. You see the bridge again, all the portholes there. A lot of wreckage, and a lot of her superstructures collapsed, but really is pretty intact. There's a bunch of torpedo tubes. You can see a set of 5 torpedo tubes. The outer 2 are open, the doors are open, and the tubes are empty. I don't know quite how to interpret that. Neil would probably know, but I don't recall if they were used somehow. She was attacked from the air, so I don't see why she would use torpedoes or why they would be open. Maybe they were just blown open. But my favorite view of the Aaron Ward is the stern. And at the time we dove her, there was a mooring on the bow and a mooring on the stern. And as you drop down on the stern and she just kind of came into view, the sight you were greeted with was 2 aft 5-inch gun turrets just pointing up at you. And obviously locked in battle, you can see they're both turned to port. They're both at elevation. I mean, these guys were fighting. This ship went down fighting, literally. She was actually towed, but then went down. I mean, literally fighting to the end. Here's some more views of the stern. In the upper left, you had another view of those 2 gun turrets, along with a Beaufort anti-aircraft emplacement in the foreground, which is kind of collapsed. You can see looking down on it in the lower side. The stern is fascinating, and if you swim off the wreck and look back at it in the upper right here, you can see it too is bent upward. I mean, it's got this remarkable bend as it goes up. You can see the 2 rudders here, and I think the props are there if I recall correctly, along with this after 5-inch gun turret. And there's a depth charge rack on the stern. One more view of the ward. This is actually under the stern in the upper right, you see, and there's some depth charges here. This is you can get inside her. I didn't do a lot inside. There's some crew quarters things here. You can see chairs and drawers thrown open. Put this in as my last slide, just so you don't think I live in a purely monochromatic world. So I do shoot some things in color too. And on the lower right, you can see, if sharp-eyed, there's a telegraph sitting here out on the deck wreckage of the main deck. So we have one more wreck we can dive. In August 13th, so this is literally a year after the initial invasion. The Japanese are still at it. They send in a bunch of torpedo planes, and at night, they torpedo by aerial torpedo the U.S. transport John Penn. You can see across the top are a set of remarkable pictures that someone captured of the anti-aircraft, I guess, gunfire or explosions when she was torpedoed. So she's actually another fantastic dive. Sits in about 190 foot of water. The problem with diving the Penn is she's further from shore, and she sits kind of unprotected, and she's swept by strong currents. And this is literally a dive where you have to pull yourself hand over hand down the anchor line. And then fortunately, when you get down there, she lies on her starboard side, I believe. And the superstructure side is the good side. It's actually shielded from the current, at least when we were there. So once you get down there, you can hide from the current on the superstructure side and explore. And I guess because of the current, she's covered in all this beautiful, colorful coral. And you can get in here. We're inside the hold a little bit, but I don't think there's a lot in there. We only did one dive each trip on this wreck, and I'd love to do more, but the current was a bear, I have to say. So in the end, again, I'm going to quote Samuel Eliot Morison, who does, "For us who were there, or whose friends were there, Guadalcanal is not a name, but an emotion, recalling desperate fights in the air, furious night naval battles, frantic work at supplier construction, savage fighting in the sodden jungle, nights broken by screaming bombs and deafening explosions of naval shells. Sometimes I dream of a great battle monument on Guadalcanal, a granite monolith on which the names of all who fell and of all ships that rest in Iron Bottom Sound may be carved. Other times, I feel that the jagged cone of Savo Island, forever brooding over the blood-thickened waters of the Sound, is the best monument to the men and ships who here rolled back the enemy tide. Special thanks to Neil Yates and Yolandi Jordan, who ran Tulagi Dive. These are the divers we went in 2006 and 2009. It's a fantastic place to dive. At the left, you see there are a few monuments there. This is John Innes, our Australian tour guide. And across the top, you see the remains of Kinagawa Maru with Savo Island in the background. That's all I have. If anyone has any questions, I'll do my best. Thanks
So
for
Brad,
this.
we do have one question. Thank you so much. It's amazing. We have one question coming in from Facebook, and Chris Stickney wanted to know, out of all the wrecks you saw or you showed us today, which one of them was your favorite to dive if you had to pick one?
The Aaron Ward, without question. Aaron Ward is a spectacular. It's a destroyer. It's a warship. It's sitting upright. I mean, it looks like it was in battle. The guns are still pointing at the aircraft that sank her. So by far, the Aaron Ward.
Great. And, you know, and somebody posted in the chat, and I'm so curious, that he is right now moored 30 meters from the Minneapolis. So
No
we have
kidding.
somebody watching who's like right there. He said, I'm moored 30 meters to Minneapolis bow at the moment with a big smiley face. And we're all
Who
jealous
is
of
it?
that big smiley face. His name is Martin.
Huh.
I don't know if Martin, you want to unmute yourself and tell us more. You want to put something in the chat, or if you even stay
Really?
with us.
I wish I were there with you.
I think we all do right now. So somebody wanted to know what cameras you were shooting in 06 and 09. Oh, that's Becca Boring. And I should mention, Brad is a Backscatter Pro for Backscatter, which is an amazing underwater photo and video store if people are interested in learning more about taking photographs underwater. And Becca works for Backscatter, but she wants to know what equipment you were using back then, back in the day.
Go Becca. Back then in 2006, I was shooting the original Canon 5D in a CCAM housing. And the second time, I believe, was a 5D Mark II, and also in a CCAM housing. Back then, they were the only manufacturers who were putting the controls in the right place. Where, being from a photographic point of view, you could control the aperture with your hands on the two handles. And so it was a very expensive CCAM housing, which was a piece of art, quite honestly. Now I've graduated to a Nauticam housing courtesy of Becca and a 5D Mark IV.
So Martin did just pop in the chat. Apparently, the one thing that we are not jealous of is his internet connection. He said his internet connection there is pretty bad. So he can't tell us more about what he's doing there. But Martin, we're all jealous of you. And we wish we could be there with you doing some diving.
Yeah, well, when we went, we stayed in Tulagi, and the conditions at the time were pretty primitive. There was really no air conditioning. There's a ceiling fan that's sort of spun. And I woke up one night. I mean, you literally would lie in bed at night. I'm sweating. And I woke up one night, this will gross you out, but I woke up in the middle of the night one night, and there were all these tiny, tiny ants crawling all over my chest because they were trying to get to the moisture of my sweat as I lie there in the middle of the night sweating in the heat and humidity. So it's an interesting place. It would be, I don't know, Neil had a fantastic dive shop and operation going there. He moved, my understanding was he moved to South Africa with Yolandi, who's originally from South Africa. But I was searching around the internet the other day, and I found pictures of him that were dated 2017 in Tulagi diving. So I don't know if he's back or if he's going back and forth or what.
So the ants curling might not be the best segue, but somebody wants to know, what are the accommodations like when you're diving?
Well, yeah, at the end, Neil had moved his operation. He was originally set up in Tulagi, which was on the north side of the Sound, and that's where the Aaron Ward and the Kanawa and the Moa are. He then moved his operation to Haniara, which is on Guadalcanal side, where, you know, a lot of the other wrecks are, but not the Aaron Ward, which is honestly the best one. You have to cross Iron Bottom Sound, which can get kind of rough. But the accommodations there are much, much better, and there are a lot more opportunities for him as a business to have tourist divers, because not too many people go over to Tulagi, quite honestly.
So Martin is really rubbing it in, because now he's telling us he's waiting to get on a ship to go to Micronesia, and he's telling us the dive shop is still there. It has new owners.
Yeah, that was my understanding. They still have the website up.
What?
Edson was a United States Marine Colonel.
Oh, apparently Edson was a United States Marine Colonel. Someone just put into the chat.
Yeah, okay. And he was, I believe I was just brushing up on some history before this. And after he was then promoted to be in charge, he was promoted after the Battle of Bloody Ridge, I believe, in charge of a larger force in the defense of Guadalcanal.
So I don't see any other questions. We want to thank you so much for an amazing, amazing presentation and beautiful photographs. Folks, so we are continuing our presentations into March. Next week, we're moving to a new time in March. So we're moving to 7 o'clock on Thursdays. On March 4th, we have Martin Klein, who is the father of side scan sonar. This guy has probably done more than a year than most of us can dream of doing in a lifetime when it comes to underwater exploration. So it's something you don't want to miss. On March 18th, and we're just announcing this now for you Pacific Theater World War II folks, we are going to have two amazing women photographers, Becca Boring from Backscatter and Brandy Mueller. Becca is going to talk about Truck Lagoon and the shipwrecks of Truck, and Brandy is going to talk about the airplane graveyard in Kwajalein Island. So you saw some of Brad's photographs of airplanes underwater. Brandy spent, I think it was 3 years, she'll correct me if I'm wrong, photographing airplanes in the Kwajalein Islands. Her photographs are stunning. Becca's photographs of Truck are stunning. So that'll be an hour of two great female wreck divers talking about the Pacific. And then on March 25th, we have Mark Corbett, a photographer who works in Northern Virginia. And he is going to talk about the shore wrecks of the Outer Banks, some really, really cool wrecks that are in relatively shallow water, and kind of like that photo Brad showed of them like sticking out and part in the water. Some really, really cool shore wrecks, some you may have heard of and some you haven't heard of. His photographs are stunning as well. So we have a great bunch of presentations coming up. Like DV Tenacious, follow DV Tenacious for updates and more information about these presentations and how you can join us. And hopefully we'll see all of you here next week at 7. I'm sorry, UK friends, we had to move it to 7 for March. But maybe you could stay up 1 hour longer to be with us.
Sleep 1 hour longer.
Sleep 1
and then
hour
wake up
longer.
1
It'll
hour
be
later.
fine. It'll be fine. We know you all stay up late anyway. But I don't see, let me just check if there's any other questions. No, I think that is it. Great, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. And like I said, if you haven't liked or followed us, please do, and you can get all the updates. Thank you.
Thanks for
Thanks,
watching.
Brad. Thank
See you
you.
guys.
Thanks, Brad.
Great job, Brad.
Thank you.